The election of 1912 is one of the most significant in the history of the United States. In many cases, an election, particularly a presidential election, can spin and turn on silly things. But sometimes these elections turn on particularly important decisions about the direction that the government should go. And 1912 was one of those elections. 1912 was a four-way election with two minor candidates and two major candidates. One of the minor candidates was the sitting president, William Howard Taft. He had become a minor candidate when Theodore Roosevelt, who we'll talk about in a minute, decided to challenge him for the presidency by challenging him for the Republican nomination. Taft went on to win the Republican nomination in the convention. He was a member of the old guard Republicans, conservative, anti-progressive by nature. Not so much Taft, who was a little wishy-washy, which is probably his biggest flaw. That is, he could not make a firm decision about which side of any domestic issue he came down on, in large part because he had a much more judicial rather than political temperament. Later, he would be appointed to the Supreme Court and served there until 1930. Another of these also ran minor candidates, which means that they didn't gain a lot of votes, but they did contribute significantly to the overall discourse in the election. Taft was kind of the right wing of the election. Eugene Debs was the left wing of the election. He was the candidate of the Socialist Party, and you may remember from our discussion of the Pullman strike in 1894, he had come to national attention in the Pullman strike as a champion of the American Railway Union and a violator of court injunctions against striking. He's considered to be the left wing of the progressive movement. He polled almost 1 million votes, which was pretty good for a third-party candidate. Now, the two major party candidates, first and foremost, I guess, is Theodore Roosevelt, who, when he did not win the nomination of the Republicans, bolted the party and took his progressive followers with him to create a new party, the Progressive Party. Now, this was a third party, but like many third parties, not like the socialists, which didn't work this way, but many third parties are personality driven. They're driven by a single individual wanting a particular political office. And this is certainly true of the Progressive Party, which never could overcome the shadow of Theodore Roosevelt. Because of a quip he made about feeling fit as a bull moose, which reporters just ate up, people began calling this the Bull Moose Party. It was completely tied to Roosevelt and his personality. It also promoted a particular vision of how the United States ought to behave and how it ought to act. This was a not particularly radical vision, certainly not as radical as either the old guard, which did not want any change of the Republican Party, or as radical as the socialists. It dealt with the role of government in the United States and the emerging role of government in the United States based on ideas of populism, based on ideas of business regulation. And Theodore Roosevelt had coined the phrase new nationalism to denote his platform. Now, Roosevelt and the people that helped him write this platform in the Progressive Party, though he had been working on it since 1910, based a lot of their ideas on Herbert Crowley's book, The Promise of American Life. Now, we've talked about Crowley as an exemplar of progressive middle-class values. before. But Crowley and his Promise of American Life was highly influential in articulating what Roosevelt and his people actually wanted to do. Crowley articulated and Roosevelt promoted the notion that there was a positive role for government in bettering human life in the United States, that government's role was to help promote social justice and to regulate trusts and other big businesses in the name of the public interest, which was not defined as either the owners or the workers, but as a third group. And I've kind of beaten on that quite a bit because I think that is the most significant introduction, the most significant concept introduced by the progressives into American political discourse. And it's not so much that they introduced it as they firmed it up as something that would not go away. So Roosevelt is a major player in his Bull Moose third party bid. The other major players, the Democrats, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson had been the president of Princeton University. He had been a one-term governor of New Jersey, born in Virginia, reared at least part of his life in Georgia. He was both a Southerner and a Northerner, you might say, in an era that still thought of the Civil War as being in living memory, and indeed it was. There were still plenty of veterans on both sides alive in this election year. Woodrow Wilson called his platform the New Freedom, and as we've said before, it was focused by Louis Brandeis, who you see here in his judicial robes. He too was on the Supreme Court. What was the federal government supposed to do? Well, unlike Roosevelt's New Nationalism, which accepted corporations and wanted the executive branch of government rather than the courts to regulate business, what the New Freedom envisioned was that the role of government was to reestablish competition by breaking up all trusts. And by trusts, they meant all big corporations. They would use the courts to break up the trusts, not executive orders or not the executive to regulate trusts. The executive was to establish rules to keep competition fair, and then the government would, once it had broken up monopolies, once it had broken up many corporations, once it had established rules that would empower small businesses, then it would go back to its negative role. That is, that it would not be very big. This was the idea of the New Freedom as extolled by Woodrow Wilson. Well, what were the results of this election? Wilson won, in large part because the socialists didn't peel off very many Democratic votes, but the split between the Republicans and the split between the old guard and the progressives among Republicans did split the normal GOP vote, allowing Wilson to win this election. The most important thing, though, and I've said it before, is that there was a serious discussion of trends in national life. And this was very much an issues-focused campaign. What was the role of government to be? How was the U.S. going to accommodate changed economic forms and changed economic power? These were the things that were discussed very seriously, from the far right, you might say, to the far left, you might say. Another important result of the election of 1912 was that for the first time since the Civil War, then Democrats dominated the national government. They had won the House in 1910 in a by-election. They won the House, the Senate, and the presidency in 1912. This was the first time since Civil War years that that Southerners were in power and a significant power, and this would tend to flavor the results of or what happened after this election in 1912. Thank you very much.